I witnessed my grandmother and her sister beat the living shit out of each other at a funeral for inheritance, and it destroyed their families. Before I explain how it happened, like and subscribe if you want more real-life stories like this, stories that don't wrap themselves up neatly and don't tell you what to think. This happened in a funeral home, not at the reception afterward, not later that night. It happened during the service. People were seated. The casket was already in place. Family members were standing shoulder to shoulder, doing what people do at funerals, staring forward, staying quiet, waiting for it to be over. I was there. I saw it from a few rows back. My grandmother, Margaret, was sitting on one side of the aisle. Her sister, Elaine, was sitting on the other. They hadn't spoken much that day. No one thought that meant anything. They were both in their 70s. People described them as stubborn, difficult, opinionated. No one described them as violent. There was no warning, no raised voices beforehand, no scene building up to it. One moment, the room was still. The next moment, both of them were standing. And then they were on each other. Not pushing, not gesturing, grabbing, hitting. Chairs scraped. Someone yelled a name. I remember looking around the room, trying to understand how this was actually happening here, in front of everyone, with the person we were burying only a few feet away. People didn't move right away, not because they didn't care, but because their brains needed time to catch up with what their eyes were seeing. These weren't strangers. These were two sisters. And the reason it started had nothing to do with what was being said at the front of the room. It had nothing to do with the service. It was about inheritance. Money that hadn't even changed hands yet. Property that still belonged to someone who was technically still alive in paperwork. A disagreement that had existed quietly for years suddenly stopped being quiet. That moment didn't just interrupt the funeral. It changed how people saw each other forever. It divided children who had grown up together. It ended holidays. It created sides that people are still standing on. And what makes this harder to talk about is that, depending on who you ask, the blame shifts. Some people say grief made them lose control. Others say the fight was inevitable once money was involved. And some people believe the funeral didn't cause anything at all. It just removed the last reason to pretend. I'm not telling this story to defend anyone. I'm telling it because I was there. And because, even now, years later, I still don't know whether what I witnessed was a sudden collapse or something that had been waiting for the right moment to happen. My name is Emily. I was 19 at the time. I wasn't standing off to the side or coming in late. I was already seated when it happened. I was in the third row, slightly to the right of the center aisle, close enough to see the casket without needing to lean forward. The service had already started. The pastor was at the front of the room. Most of the seats were filled with family. Aunts, uncles, cousins. There were children there too, sitting beside their parents, some of them swinging their legs because they didn't really understand where they were or why everyone was quiet. My grandmother, Margaret, was seated on the left side of the aisle. Her sister, Elaine, was seated on the right. They were close enough to see each other clearly, but far enough apart that no one thought seating would matter. From where I was sitting, I could see both of them without turning my head. I remember that because when they stood up, I didn't have to look around to understand what was happening. It was all in front of me at once. One moment, the room was still. The next, chairs moved back at the same time. There wasn't a build-up. There wasn't an exchange that warned anyone. No raised voices beforehand. No visible tension that people reacted to. It happened quickly enough that it took a second to register this wasn't confusion or someone standing up at the wrong time. I remember how quiet the room felt once people realized what they were seeing, not because everything stopped right away, but because no one knew how to respond yet. I didn't look away. I didn't move. I was close enough to see expressions clearly and far enough back to notice how everyone else reacted, or didn't. I wasn't told about it later. I didn't hear about it secondhand. I was there. I saw it clearly. To understand why that moment shocked everyone in the room, you have to know a little about who my grandmother and her sister were before that day. My grandmother, Margaret, was the older of the two. She had lived in the same town most of her adult life. She raised her kids there. She worked locally. People knew her as someone who handled things. She organized holidays. She kept track of birthdays. When something needed to be done for the family, she usually did it. Her sister, Elaine, lived in a different state for most of my life. She visited, but she wasn't around in the same way. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of families have one sibling who stays close and another who moves away. Growing up, I didn't hear people talk about conflict between them. If there were disagreements, they weren't shared with us. As kids, we saw them as related but separate. They weren't inseparable, but they weren't openly hostile either. The tension people talk about now wasn't visible back then. What did exist was a difference in roles. When my great-parents' health started declining, Margaret was the one nearby. She handled appointments, she coordinated care, she dealt with day-to-day issues that didn't travel well over phone calls. Elaine helped in other ways. She sent money sometimes. She visited when she could. But the responsibilities weren't equal, and everyone knew that. Still, it wasn't something people argued about openly. It was just understood. Over time, expectations formed quietly. Margaret assumed certain things would be acknowledged. Elaine assumed distance didn't mean exclusion. No one ever sat them down to define those expectations clearly. They existed without being written down. The inheritance was another one of those unspoken subjects. People had assumptions about how it would be handled. Some thought caregiving would matter more. Others believed everything would be divided evenly. Those beliefs didn't come from documents. They came from years of interpretation. As far as I knew at the time, none of this was actively being argued about. If there were disagreements, they stayed between the two of them. No one warned us, no one said the funeral might be tense, no one suggested seating arrangements or separate conversations beforehand. That's why what happened felt so sudden. From the outside, this still looked like a family doing what families do, showing up, sitting quietly, and waiting for the service to end. No one in that room expected a breakdown, especially not one that would leave people choosing sides for the rest of their lives. The moment that set everything off didn't feel important at first. It wasn't announced. It wasn't meant for the whole room to hear. It started as a comment, said quietly, close enough for only a few people to catch it. We were standing during a pause in the service. People were shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. I remember my grandmother, Margaret, leaning slightly toward her sister's side of the aisle. She said something about the house. Not angrily, not loudly, just a sentence that assumed agreement. Elaine responded right away. Her reply wasn't raised either, but it was firm. It included a phrase I would hear repeated later by different people, each time with a different meaning attached to it. She said that their parent had wanted things handled a certain way. The words themselves weren't unusual. People say things like that all the time at funerals. What changed was how Margaret reacted. She straightened in her seat. She turned fully this time, not halfway. Elaine stood up before anyone else had time to register that the exchange wasn't finished. Margaret stood too. At that point, it still looked like an argument might happen. People shifted, expecting raised voices. Some family members leaned forward, ready to intervene if needed. That's when the conversation stopped being verbal. There wasn't a long exchange, no back and forth. One movement followed another almost immediately. And suddenly, the thing everyone assumed would stay private was happening in full view of the room. I remember noticing how quickly the focus of the service disappeared. No one was looking at the front anymore. No one was listening to what was being said. The attention shifted all at once, not because people wanted to watch, but because there was no way not to. Whatever had been held in quietly for years didn't stay contained in that moment. It moved faster than anyone expected, and once it crossed that line, there was no way to bring it back into words. It didn't last long. That's the part people get wrong later. They imagine something drawn out, something loud. It wasn't. It was sudden and close. Margaret reached first. Elaine reacted immediately. There wasn't space between them once it started. Chairs were pushed back. Someone stood up too fast and knocked one over. I remember the sound more than anything else. Shoes sliding on the floor, fabric pulling. Someone said my grandmother's name. Someone else said Elaine's. No one knew which one to grab first. A few people moved forward at the same time, then hesitated. It was clear right away that this wasn't something you could politely interrupt. When people did step in, it wasn't coordinated. Hands came from different directions. Voices overlapped. The service had completely stopped by then. No one at the front was speaking anymore. The room felt smaller, not tense in a dramatic way, just focused. Everyone was watching the same thing, trying to understand how it had gone this far, this fast. And then, almost as quickly as it started, it ended. Not because anything was resolved, but because enough people were between them to keep it from continuing. What stayed behind was silence. Not respectful silence, the kind that happens when no one knows what the next appropriate action is supposed to be. After people pulled them apart, no one knew what to do next. The service didn't resume. The pastor stood at the front of the room without speaking. Someone whispered to him, but whatever was said didn't change anything. Margaret was taken toward one side of the room. Elaine was moved in the opposite direction. That separation happened almost instinctively, like everyone understood that keeping them apart mattered more than anything else. Family members started making choices without talking about them. Some people followed my grandmother. Others stayed with Elaine. A few people didn't move at all. They stayed seated, staring forward, as if the service might somehow restart if they waited long enough. I remember noticing the casket again at that point. It hadn't moved. It was still at the front of the room, exactly where it had been before everything stopped. Someone suggested taking a break. Someone else suggested ending the service early. No decision was announced. People just started leaving. Some walked out quietly. Others left in small groups, talking under their breath. Children were guided toward the exit without explanation. I could hear adults lowering their voices around them, not to protect feelings, but because they didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Outside the room, conversations splintered. People compared what they thought they had seen. People asked each other what had been said first. No one agreed on the details. What everyone agreed on was that something had shifted. This wasn't going to be smoothed over later. The idea that we would all gather again afterward, share food, and talk quietly about memories felt unrealistic almost immediately. Plans changed without being discussed. Some families left entirely. Others stayed, but only with people who had already chosen the same side they had. The funeral ended without a clear ending. There was no final prayer that everyone stood for together, no moment that brought the room back into one group. What happened instead was separation, and once that separation started, it didn't stop at the doors of the funeral home. What happened in that room didn't stay there. At first, people treated it like an isolated incident, something shocking but contained, something that could be talked about quietly and then set aside. That didn't happen. In the weeks that followed, the family didn't come back together to process it. We separated further. Phone calls stopped going to certain numbers. Group messages went silent or split into smaller ones. People began referring to each other indirectly, her side, their side. No one announced those divisions. They formed on their own. Holidays were the first thing to change. Thanksgiving was no longer one event. It became two. Christmas followed the same pattern. Invitations were cautious. People asked who else would be there before committing. Some stopped asking at all. Cousins who had grown up together stopped seeing each other regularly, not because they had argued, but because their parents no longer spoke. Birthdays became complicated. Graduations were negotiated in advance. Weddings were discussed in terms of seating charts before dates. The inheritance itself became something people talked around, not about. Details surfaced slowly. Who had been named where? Who had expected what? Who felt overlooked? Each new piece of information didn't resolve anything. It hardened positions. Margaret stopped attending events where Elaine might be present. Elaine made it clear she wouldn't be in the same room as Margaret again. Those statements were taken seriously. People adjusted their lives around them. Over time, the story of the person we had buried changed too. Conversations about them were no longer neutral. Their decisions were reinterpreted depending on who was speaking. What had once been shared memories became evidence. As years passed, the fight at the funeral stopped being described as a single event. It became a reference point. Before the funeral, after the funeral, people measured family history against that moment. New conflicts were traced back to it. Old disagreements were relabeled as warnings that should have been noticed earlier. The younger generation grew up inside those divisions. Some of us learned which topics to avoid early. Others learned to stay quiet altogether. I noticed how often adults lowered their voices when the subject came up, even years later, not out of respect, out of caution. The inheritance was eventually settled on paper, but nothing else was. The money didn't bring closure. It just confirmed outcomes people had already emotionally committed to. Looking back, it's hard to point to a single relationship that was repaired afterward. Some weakened, some ended completely, and some stayed intact only because both sides agreed not to revisit what happened. What stayed consistent was the distance, physical distance, emotional distance. The fight lasted minutes. The consequences lasted years. As more time passed, people started telling the story differently. Not the facts exactly, but the meaning behind them. Depending on who you talk to, what happened at the funeral either made complete sense or made no sense at all. Some people said my grandmother had done more for the family and felt pushed aside at the end. Others said Elaine had every right to expect things to be split evenly, no matter who lived closer or handled more day-to-day stuff. And the thing is, both arguments sounded reasonable when you heard them separately. That's what made it uncomfortable. When people talked about the inheritance, they weren't just talking about money, they were talking about time, about effort, about who showed up more. People started asking questions out loud that had never really been asked before. Should caregiving count more than distance? Does living nearby mean you're owed more? Does helping financially matter as much as being physically present? No one agreed. Even people who were on the same side disagreed on the reasons. Some said grief made everyone act out of character. Others said grief just removed the pressure to stay polite. A few people believed the fight would have happened eventually, funeral or not, that the service just happened to be where it finally came out. And then there were people who thought the inheritance itself was the problem, that once money's involved, especially money tied to someone's death, it changes how people behave. I heard all of these explanations growing up. None of them fully explained what I saw, because I had watched two people who had managed to stay civil for decades lose control in front of everyone they loved, and I couldn't decide if that meant something snapped suddenly or if it meant something had been held together for too long. What made it harder was realizing how normal it all started to feel after the fact. Once the lines were drawn, people adjusted quickly. New traditions formed, new guest lists were made. People learned what topics to avoid and which names not to say out loud. It didn't feel dramatic after a while, it just felt like how things were now. And that's the part that still sticks with me. Not the fight itself, but how quickly everyone learned to live around it. It made me wonder whether the inheritance actually caused the collapse, or whether it just made something visible that had been sitting there for years. As I got older, the way I thought about that day kept changing. When it first happened, it felt shocking, like something that shouldn't exist in your memory at all. But over time, it started to feel more complicated than that. I'd hear people talk about it at different points in my life, usually quietly, usually when they thought kids weren't listening anymore. Everyone remembered it a little differently. Some people focused on who started it, some people focused on who stepped in, others talked about what should have happened instead, as if that mattered now. What stood out to me was how rarely anyone talked about the person we were there to bury. Their name came up less and less over time. Instead, the funeral became known for the fight. That moment replaced everything else. I also noticed how careful people became around each other afterward. Conversations felt edited. Invitations came with disclaimers. You could tell who still spoke regularly and who hadn't talked in years, just by the way people asked questions. I don't remember anyone ever sitting down and saying, "This is what went wrong." It just settled. Everyone adjusted in their own way. Some people stayed angry, others stayed distant, and some acted like nothing had happened at all, as long as the right people weren't in the same room. When I think back to that day now, what surprises me isn't the fight itself anymore. It's how quickly it rewrote everything that came after. One moment turned into a reference point for years of decisions, and no matter how much time passed, no one ever really agreed on what it meant. Even now, if you bring it up, people still disagree. Some say the inheritance ruined the family. Others say the family was already fractured and the money just brought it into the open. Some think grief explains the loss of control. Others think grief just removed the reason to hold back. I've heard people argue that funerals bring out emotions people don't normally show. I've also heard people say funerals don't change people at all. They just put everyone in the same place at the same time. I don't know which explanation is right. I only know what I saw. I saw two sisters stop being sisters in a room full of family. I saw adults choose sides without saying they were choosing sides. And I saw how one moment turned into something that followed everyone long after the service ended. What still gets me is how normal it all feels now. The distance, the separation, the way people learned to work around it instead of fixing it. I don't know if the inheritance caused the collapse or if it just exposed something that had been waiting for the right moment. And I don't know which possibility is harder to accept. If you were there that day, you'd probably have your own opinion. If you've seen something similar in your own family, you probably already do. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was it about money? Was it about grief? Or was it something that had nothing to do with the funeral at all? And if you want more real stories like this, stories that don't give easy answers, make sure you like the video and subscribe.